everyone, my name is Christine and I'm going to do a sort of commentary over the time-lapse video of me making my geode table. I'll add little comments about products I'm using or thoughts that I was having while making this piece. I had originally had a design drawn out on this that I didn't like, and I could not figure out how to remove the paint pen that I had used. It's not acrylic or anything, it's just like one of those permanent paint pens. I had tried denatured alcohol and it didn't work, so I ended up trying acetone and it worked like a charm. I knew I needed to draw out the design because when I see something in my head and then try to put that onto what I'm working on, it never works out. So I figured if I had a rough outline of what I was trying to do, I would somewhat at least stick to that. Wanted to see what a couple of the different things combined together looked like. It's sort of part of my process. I do it on all of my other pieces too. Sometimes with the different sizes of the crushed glass that I use, which are various things from Michael's, like vase filler and stuff like that, there isn't enough difference between the size to create a texture I'm looking for or a contrast in color, so that's what I was doing there. Here's where I made what I thought was my first mistake. I went over these few lines with hot glue where I wanted to create the distinct sections with different colors or textures. I was of the mind that I was going to remove it once whatever I put down had set a little bit. But it's clear, so there was no need to do that. But when I tested trying to remove the hot glue, it was impossible. So I ended up going over all the lines with some acrylic glass paint. I would have been better off just leaving the hot glue. This is the next day after I had laid down the acrylic glass paint. I was still unsure about what I was going to do. I didn't know if I was going to do some acrylic pouring with different resins or all resin, and I finally just figured I'd go all resin because I didn't want to have to do where I glued down the rocks, let that dry, then did some paint, let that dry, so all resin it is. This first section I used Daler Rowney acrylic ink in Velvet Violet. It's sort of a pearlescent purple. I started with just a few drops to see how that worked, and it was extremely light, so I added the glitter and stuff to color it to see how that went. And I actually really don't like this section a whole lot because, as you can see, I kept adding stuff to it to make it better, and it just made it worse. But it is a very small section and it's not terrible when it ties into the rest of it. I also went over it right there with the torch to bring all the bubbles out, even though it was filled with glitter. It makes it have that like glassy sheen. Now this next section, I knew I wanted it to be clear, like when you get sort of towards the center of a geode, or at least part of it clear, because I knew I was going to add the iridescent snowflake stuff, which I use in all of my geode paintings now. I like that weird mica texture it has, and it's iridescent, so it looks gorgeous in pretty much any light. This next section is going to be the clear glass, and I realized a split second after starting to pour that obviously if it's clear glass and clear resin, you're going to be able to see the words written underneath, so I quickly removed those. I also noticed that the acrylic paint lines that I had laid down to keep the resin contained were quite thin, so I went over them to reinforce them because I knew if I didn't it was going to spill over. So that's what I'm doing there. I started with the smallest amounts of resin as possible. It is self-leveling, but I wanted to speed that up a little bit, and I pushed it into all of the other little crevices and stuff that it didn't quite flow to on its own. And for the purposes of laying the rock down, that was plenty. I didn't want to put more resin in there than needed, especially since once you put the weight of the rocks down, the resin, would push on, especially since they're wet, those lines that I use to contain the resin. I actually ran out of room on my memory card, and it stopped recording while I was doing the purple layer, but it's the exact same as the clear glass layer, so you didn't miss much there. This is going to be for the middle section that says small purple glass. I actually did not stick to what I wrote down on here because I had looked at some pictures of geodes, and one of the main things that I found they all had in common is that one super vibrant section that wasn't really texturized or anything like that, and that's what I wanted to go here. The purple ink I used in the other sections didn't have that oomph I was looking for, so I decided to brave using acrylic paint, and it's actually absolutely no different than just using the ink, but you just have to make sure that you don't put too much because you'll actually ruin your resin. It's like 1 part media to 10 parts resin, so you got to start small, and this was actually the perfect color for me. I wanted to create some contrast between the white layer and the purple layer, so I went with some dark purple, and actually all I did was add a little extra purple paint to the leftover purple from the center, and that worked perfectly. It did get a little gooey, but since I was just using it for that one part, that was okay. I was pretty much done with that part of the purple. Here I'm just blowing the dark purple into the lighter purple to create, I don't know, I guess like a visual texture. I really don't know what to call it, but I absolutely love it. Here I am using the same brand as the purple ink that I used in the first section, but it is gold. And one thing I can tell you is that it dries really fast. So as you can see, I did across the whole arc. Only do what you can manipulate if that's what you want to do within, a minute or two. This is obviously time-lapsed, but it took me, a minute or two to get to that other side. And what happened is it actually just dried in the top layer of the resin. As you can see, like I'm trying to manipulate it there. It was fairly difficult to move it around once it dried. Here I'm just laying down pieces of the 23 karat gold leaf. This is a little box of scraps that I have from other projects that I've done because you don't want to waste that stuff. It's really expensive, so I can create, whatever size and shape of little flakes that I want. But they do sell the flakes in a bag. Since I did have a little bit of that purple left over and I didn't do a very good job of covering over that gold line in between those two layers, I did decide to lay it down. This layer, all I did was mix white acrylic paint into the resin. It was so white and it had no contrast to the rest of the table that I actually take a little bit of parchment and mixed a little of it with some resin and just kind of wisped it in there to make it look more rock-like, I guess, and so it wasn't just starkly white, it had some contrast to it. This I did because my first geode painting was purple. It was a mixture of rocks and acrylic pouring. And I had done this on the edge of that painting. And I had asked in a group, like, why does everybody love this painting so much? Because I particularly don't care for it. And a lot of people said they loved the way that the color went into the flat white part, and the flat white part was a nice smooth contrast to how texturized the rest of it was. So I decided to incorporate that in this one. I wanted to give it more depth and character, so I do the 2 shades of purple, and I actually do another layer of gold over this as well. And the way it looks into the white, it is like this really cool marble effect. It's absolutely gorgeous.